He was once called the King of Kings, and he died in a borrowed hospital bed in a country that wasn't his body eaten by cancer, a little bag of his homeland's soil hidden under his pillow. No nation on earth wanted to take him. He was one of the rulers who lived to watch their own kingdom vanish, and died knowing he was the last. Number 12. Imagine being handed the crown of an ancient royal house, one that had ruled for the better part of a century, and losing the entire kingdom before you'd even finished unpacking. That is the almost unbelievable story of Umberto II of Italy, a man history remembers by a name that's half a joke and half a tragedy, the May King. The House of Savoy had ruled Italy since the country was first unified in 1861. For 85 years, they were the royal family of Italy through wars and triumphs and disasters. But by 1946, the monarchy was drowning. Umberto's father, King Victor Emmanuel III, had made a catastrophic mistake. He had cozied up to Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, and let him drag Italy into the Second World War on the side of Hitler. By the time the war ended, Italy was in ruins and the royal family's name was mud. So the old king came up with a desperate plan. He would abdicate, step down, and hand the crown to his son Umberto, who was young, handsome, and hadn't been the one shaking hands with Mussolini. Maybe, just maybe, a fresh face could save the monarchy. It was a gamble, and the whole kingdom was the bet. On the 9th of May, 1946, Umberto became King of Italy, and almost immediately, the country held a referendum, a national vote, to decide whether Italy should stay a monarchy or become a republic. This was the vote that would decide whether Umberto's crown meant anything at all. He reigned while the votes were being counted. He reigned for 34 days. And then the results came in. The people of Italy had voted to abolish the monarchy. By a margin of about 9 points, the country chose to become a republic and to send its brand new king away forever. Now here is the moment that tells you what kind of man Umberto was. His supporters, and there were many, especially in the South, begged him to fight. The vote had been close. There were accusations of irregularities. He had the loyalty of monarchists and parts of the military. He could have contested the result, dug in, maybe even sparked a civil war to keep his throne. Kings had done far worse, for far less. Umberto refused. He said one line that has echoed ever since. "My house united Italy. I will not divide it." He would not set his own people against each other to save his crown. He chose to lose the throne rather than tear the country apart. On the 13th of June, 1946, he left the Quirinal Palace in Rome for the last time. And the accounts of that departure are genuinely heartbreaking. The palace servants, the cooks, the maids, the ordinary staff, gathered in the courtyard to see him off, and many of them were openly weeping. As he arrived at the airport to board the plane that would carry him into exile, a single carabiniere, an Italian policeman, pushed forward and grabbed the king's hand and said, "Your Majesty, we will never forget you." Then he got on the plane and flew to Portugal, and he never saw Italy again. And I mean never. The new Italian Republic wrote a law into its very constitution banning the male heirs of the House of Savoy from ever setting foot on Italian soil. Umberto was legally forbidden from going home. He settled in a quiet seaside town in Portugal, and there he stayed, year after year, sending New Year's messages to a slowly shrinking group of loyal monarchists back in a country that had moved on without him. He lived in that exile for 37 years, 34 days on the throne, 37 years banished. And as he lay dying in 1983, gravely ill, an old man now, he had one final wish, just to come home to Italy to die. Even then, even for a dying man, the ban held firm. The politicians debated it, and the permission did not come in time. Umberto died in Geneva, Switzerland, on foreign soil, still exiled from the country his family had built. He asked not to be buried in Italy, while the ban that kept him out was still law, a final act of wounded pride. And so the last king of Italy lies buried in an abbey in France, in the wrong country, forever. 34 days a king, a lifetime locked out. And he's only number 12, because as sad as Umberto's story is, he at least had a comfortable exile. The next man handed away one of the oldest thrones in Asia with a single sentence, and then spent 50 years chasing pleasure in the casinos of Europe, trying to forget he'd ever worn a crown at all. Number 11. Some monarchs cling to their thrones until they're torn away. This one let go with a single, famous sentence, and then vanished into a half-century of nightclubs, casinos, and mistresses, becoming one of the strangest fallen emperors who ever lived. His name was Bao Dai, and he was the last emperor of Vietnam, the 13th and final ruler of the Nguyen Dynasty, a royal line that had reigned for a century and a half. He was born in 1913 inside the magnificent imperial palace in the city of Hue, on the banks of a river so lovely it's called the Perfume River. And almost from the start, his life was pulled in two directions at once. Because while he was the sacred emperor of Vietnam, his country was in reality a colony, controlled by the French. As a boy, he was shipped off to be educated in Paris, where he learned tennis, golf, skiing, and a taste for European luxury that would define and ultimately consume the rest of his life. He came back to sit on a throne that had almost no real power. For most of his reign, the French pulled the strings, and then, during the Second World War, the Japanese occupiers did. Bao Dai was an emperor in name, a figurehead decorating someone else's empire, and he seemed to know it. He largely retreated into the pleasures available to him: hunting, women, fast cars, the good life, earning himself a reputation as a playboy emperor long before his kingdom actually fell. Then came 1945, and the Great Unraveling. Japan surrendered. Vietnam erupted in revolution, and Ho Chi Minh's communist Viet Minh swept toward power. And Bao Dai, reading the moment with a clarity that surprised everyone, did something almost no emperor in history has done willingly. He abdicated. He handed over the two sacred symbols of his 1,500-year-old imperial line, the golden imperial seal and the imperial sword, to representatives of the new revolutionary government. And he said the words that would follow him forever. He would rather be a citizen of an independent country than the emperor of an enslaved one. With that one sentence, the Nguyen dynasty was finished, and 150 years of Vietnamese monarchy came to an end. He briefly served as a supreme advisor to Ho Chi Minh's new government and was, for a moment, actually popular, the emperor who gave up his crown for his people's freedom. But it didn't last. Distrusted by the communists and unwilling to be their ornament, he slipped away into exile. And here his story takes its strange turn. Because the French, now fighting a brutal war to hold on to Vietnam, decided they needed a non-communist figurehead, and they dragged Bao Dai back, installing him as the chief of state of a French-backed Vietnam. Once again, he was a puppet, a crown with no power. And once again, he barely bothered to hide his disinterest. He spent his time not in the capital, but at the beach resorts and mountain villas, gambling, hunting, chasing the pleasures he actually cared about. People started calling him the nightclub emperor. His lavish lifestyle, when his own money ran out, was reportedly funded by French intelligence, a fallen emperor on an allowance from a foreign spy service so he could keep up appearances at the casino. The end came in 1955, when his own prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, staged a rigged referendum, abolished the monarchy, and pushed Bao Dai out for good. And so began the final, longest act of his life: exile in France. And it lasted almost half a century. The man who had been the emperor of Vietnam, the son of heaven of an ancient dynasty, lived out more than 40 years in France as a private citizen, sliding through a life of faded glamour and dwindling money, married and remarried, drifting further and further from the throne he'd given away. Near the very end, he converted to Catholicism and took a new name, Jean Robert. the last emperor of Vietnam, dying under a French Christian name, about as far from the Perfume River and the Imperial Palace as a human being could possibly get. He died in a military hospital in Paris in 1997 at the age of 83, having spent well over half his life in exile. He had held one of the oldest thrones in Asia, and he'd handed it away in an afternoon, then spent 50 years trying to enjoy the fall. Whether that made him a coward or the only clear-eyed realist among all these doomed monarchs, you can decide for yourself. The next king also saw the end coming. In fact, he predicted it, with one of the most famous and most bitterly accurate jokes any monarch ever told. Number 10. Some monarchs are blindsided by the fall of their kingdoms. This one saw it coming with almost cynical clarity. He cracked jokes about it, and it still didn't save him. He simply ate, gambled, and spent his way to the end of one of the shortest-lived royal lines in modern history. His name was Farouk, and he was the king of Egypt. Farouk came to the throne in 1936 as a slim, handsome, genuinely popular 16-year-old. Egypt adored him at first, young, glamorous, the hope of a modern nation. But it curdled, and it curdled fast. Over the years that followed, Farouk transformed, in the eyes of his people and the world, into a symbol of everything rotten about monarchy. Bloated, corrupt, lazy, and staggeringly self-indulgent. He ballooned in weight until he was famously paunchy and bald, and his appetites became the stuff of legend. The man was a compulsive collector and consumer on an almost cartoonish scale. He amassed 1,000 bespoke suits. He hoarded jewels, watches, coins, and cars. He collected pornographic photographs and, according to reports, a pornographic necktie collection. He was such a notorious kleptomaniac that he reportedly picked pockets, allegedly even lifting a watch off Winston Churchill. He would eat dozens of oysters at a sitting. He gambled away fortunes in the casinos of Europe while his people grew poorer and angrier. He was, in short, the very picture of a decadent king fiddling while his kingdom burned. And the disasters piled up. Egypt's humiliating defeat in the 1948 war against the new state of Israel was blamed partly on Farouk. There were accusations that his personal corruption had left the army equipped with shoddy, defective weapons that got Egyptian soldiers killed. The officers who survived that war came home humiliated and furious, and they blamed their king. Among them was a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who began quietly building a secret movement inside the army, the Free Officers, dedicated to overthrowing the monarchy. Now here's what makes Farouk fascinating, because it wasn't that he didn't see it coming. He absolutely did. He once made a joke that turned out to be one of the most accurate predictions any doomed monarch ever uttered. Watching thrones topple all across the world in the aftermath of the Second World War, Farouk quipped that soon there would be only 5 kings left in the entire world: the King of England, and the kings of hearts, diamonds, spades, and clubs. The 4 kings in a deck of cards, plus 1. He knew. He knew the age of monarchs was ending, that they were all being swept away, and that he was probably next. And knowing it, he did nothing but keep eating and gambling and collecting. The end came in July of 1952. The Free Officers launched their coup, and it succeeded almost bloodlessly. Public opinion had turned so completely against Farouk that his army seized control of the country with barely a shot fired. They gave the king an ultimatum: abdicate and get out of Egypt by 6 o'clock, or else. Farouk signed away his throne at noon, handing the crown, absurdly, to his infant son, a 6-month-old baby, who technically became King Fuad II of Egypt, and who would reign as a baby for less than a year before Egypt abolished the monarchy entirely. And then Farouk fled, in the grandest, most Farouk way imaginable. He boarded the royal yacht and sailed off into exile, and the accounts of that departure are almost unbelievable. He was forced to leave behind his 1,000 suits and his infamous collections. But he made sure to bring the important things. Crates were loaded onto the yacht, labeled champagne and whiskey, that had been secretly packed full of gold bars. The king was smuggling out his gold disguised as booze, right under the noses of the officers who overthrew him. He never saw Egypt again. Farouk settled into a life of luxurious European exile: Capri, Monaco, Rome. And he did exactly what he'd always done. He ate, he gambled, he chased women, and he ballooned to an enormous size. His new government back home sold off his fabulous collections and put his jewels in museums. His wife, tired of his endless philandering, divorced him and went home to Egypt. And his death was as fitting an end as his life. On a night in March of 1965, in a restaurant in Rome, the former king of Egypt sat down to an enormous midnight supper, course after course, in the company of a 22-year-old blonde companion. And having finished this gargantuan meal, Farouk lit a cigarette and collapsed face down at the table, dead of a heart attack. He was 45 years old. He had, quite literally, eaten himself to death at a restaurant table, in exile, far from the throne he'd always known he would lose. Farouk saw the fall coming and chose to enjoy the ride down. The next emperor on our list never wanted the crown in the first place, and he loved his country so deeply that when the moment came, he refused to shed a single drop of his people's blood to keep it. Number 9. Here is one of history's cruelest ironies. You can be a genuinely good ruler. You can be loved by your people. You can bring your country peace and progress for nearly 50 years. And you can still lose everything in a single morning to a small group of men, while the nation that adores you simply watches it happen. That was the fate of Dom Pedro II, the last emperor of Brazil. Pedro became emperor when he was a child. His father abdicated and sailed away when Pedro was just 5 years old, leaving a little boy as the symbolic head of a vast empire. He grew up lonely inside palaces, a shy, bookish child who, in the words of one person close to him, saw books as a refuge from the real world. And he grew into one of the most impressive monarchs of the entire 19th century. For nearly 50 years, Pedro II ruled Brazil, an empire bigger than the continental United States, and he ruled it well. Under him, Brazil was stable and peaceful, while the rest of South America convulsed with coups and civil wars. He championed education and science. He was fascinated by technology and helped bring the telephone and the telegraph to Brazil. He corresponded with inventors and scientists around the world. He was modest, honest, and democratic in spirit, a man who genuinely seemed to care more about his country than his own power. He even helped push through the abolition of slavery in Brazil, the last country in the Western world to end it. And that, strangely, was part of his undoing. When slavery was abolished in 1888, the wealthy landowners who had depended on it were furious, and their loyalty to the emperor curdled. At the same time, a rising class of military officers and Republican intellectuals had started to see the whole idea of a monarchy as old-fashioned, an embarrassing relic in a modern world. Pedro was aging, tired, and in poor health. He had no son to succeed him, only a daughter, and the elites didn't like the idea of an empress. So in November of 1889, a small group of military officers moved against him. And here's the astonishing part. It was barely even a fight. It was a coup carried out by a relatively small clique with, by most accounts, limited popular support. The ordinary people of Brazil didn't rise up against Pedro. Many of them barely knew it was happening until it was over. Historians have long believed that if Pedro had simply called on his people to defend him, they would have come. He was still popular. He could very likely have kept his throne. He didn't call them. When they came to tell the old emperor that he had been deposed, that the empire was finished and a republic declared, Pedro didn't rage or fight or plead. He said with a kind of exhausted grace, "If it is so, it will be my retirement. I have worked too hard and I am tired. I will go rest then." They gave him and his family barely any time. They were put on a ship and sent across the ocean to Europe, into exile, and forbidden to return. And the fall from there was steep and brutal. This man who had ruled an empire for half a century now drifted through the modest hotels of Europe, increasingly poor, increasingly alone. His beloved wife, the Empress Teresa Cristina, could not survive the shock and grief of losing their home. She died just 3 weeks after they arrived in Europe. Some said it was a broken heart. Pedro was left completely alone. For 2 years he wandered, a lonely, melancholy old man, living in cheap lodgings, spending his days on the studies and books that had always been his refuge. And in his private journals, he wrote about his dreams in which he was allowed to go back to Brazil, back home, one more time. He never was. In December of 1891, Dom Pedro II died in a hotel room in Paris, far from the empire he had served for nearly 60 years. And there's a final, bitter twist that makes his story ache even more. Decades after his death, after Brazil's republic proved every bit as turbulent and troubled as monarchies can be, the Brazilian people reassessed the gentle emperor they had let slip away. Today, he is often ranked among the greatest figures in the country's entire history. They eventually brought his body home with national honors. He finally got to return to Brazil, but only as a corpse, decades too late to know it. Pedro lost his throne because he loved his country too much to fight for himself. The next monarch on our list lost his kingdom to something far more ruthless, the most powerful empire on the planet, which wanted his land, his teak forests, and a ruby worth a kingdom. Number 8. In the heart of the city of Mandalay stood one of the most magnificent royal palaces in all of Asia. A vast complex of gilded halls and soaring spires, the seat of the Burmese kings, glittering with gold and jewels. And in 1885, the last king who ever ruled from that palace was led out of its gates and set on a common bullock cart, like a farmer hauling rice, and carried away into an exile that would never end. His name was Thibaw, and he was the last king of Burma. Thibaw had come to the throne young, in his 20s, trained partly as a Buddhist monk, with very little experience of the world outside the palace walls. His reign was troubled from the start, dominated by his fierce and formidable queen, Supailat. But Thibaw's real problem wasn't inside his palace. It was the British Empire, sitting right on his border, hungry. The British already controlled southern Burma. They wanted the north too. They wanted access to trade routes into China. They wanted the country's rich resources, and above all, they wanted to get there before their French rivals did. All they needed was an excuse. And they manufactured one out of a dispute over a British timber company that was harvesting teak from Burmese forests. When Thibaw's government fined the company for cheating, the British issued an impossible ultimatum. And when Thibaw didn't fully surrender to it, they invaded. It was over almost before it began. In November of 1885, British forces marched on Mandalay, and the Golden City fell with barely a fight. King Thibaw, 27 years old, was forced to surrender and abdicate. Centuries of the Burmese monarchy ended in a matter of days. And then came the humiliation, which the British designed very deliberately. Before he was taken away, Thibaw was made to hand over his most precious treasures to a British colonel, including the legendary Nha Mok ruby, one of the most fabled gemstones in the world, a personal jewel of the Burmese kings, said to be worth an entire kingdom. Thibaw surrendered it, believing it would be kept safe. He never saw it again. And here is a mystery that endures to this very day. The Nha Mok ruby vanished. Nobody knows what happened to it. One of the most valuable gems on earth, gone, somewhere into the pockets of empire, never seen again. Then they brought out the bullock carts. 2 of them, the simple ox-drawn carts that common people used in the streets of Mandalay. And they placed the king and queen of Burma into these humble carts and drove them out through the palace gates, down streets lined with British soldiers, past their own weeping, wailing subjects, down to the river where a steamboat waited to carry them away. There's a portrait of that day, painted at the time, of the royal family standing under umbrellas as they're led to the river, their palace shrinking behind them. Queen Supayalot, defiant to the last, is said to have coolly asked one of the British soldiers by the roadside for a light for her cheroot, a small cigar, as she was marched into exile. If she was going down, she was going down without flinching. They were shipped across the sea to India, to a remote, obscure little coastal town called Ratnagiri, chosen specifically because it was in the middle of nowhere, far from Burma, far from anyone who might rally to the king. And there, Thibaw spent the rest of his life. 31 years. In a foreign country, under house arrest, in a house reportedly near a plague and leper colony. The family's money dwindled, and the once golden king was reduced to selling off his remaining jewels just to make ends meet. Indian officials treated the fallen royals with open disrespect. Two of his daughters, growing up in that lonely exile with no royal world left around them, married men far below their former station. Thibaw died in Ratnagiri in 1916, still in exile, 31 years after he lost his kingdom, having never once been allowed to see Burma again. And the cruelty extended even past death. The British refused to allow his body to be returned home to Burma. They were afraid, genuinely afraid, that the sight of the dead king's body arriving in his homeland might spark calls for independence, might remind the Burmese people of what they had lost. So they kept him in the ground in India. The last king of Burma remains buried in the wrong country to this day. Thibaw lost his kingdom to a foreign empire that swallowed it whole. The next family on our list ruled an empire of their own for 600 years and were spiritual leaders to millions around the world before they were given 72 hours to pack a bag and disappear. Number 7. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman dynasty ruled one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Founded around the year 1300, the House of Osman built an empire that stretched across 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. They conquered Constantinople itself, the city we'll come back to at the very end of this list. And they held a title even greater than emperor. The Sultan was also the Caliph, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the supreme spiritual leader of much of the Muslim world. Hundreds of millions of people looked to him as God's representative on earth. 600 years of that. And it ended with 2 frightened men slipping out of the country in the dark. The empire had been dying for a long time, losing wars, losing territory, buckling under the strain. And the First World War finished it off. The Ottomans had backed Germany, and when Germany lost, the empire collapsed. Out of the ashes rose a new leader, the General Mustafa Kemal, who would become known as Ataturk, and he was determined to sweep the old royal world away entirely and build a modern republic in its place. The last sultan to actually reign was Mehmed VI, and in 1922, as Ataturk's new government abolished the sultanate, Mehmed VI realized he was in real danger. So the last sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the heir to Suleiman the Magnificent, the ruler of a 600-year empire, snuck out of his own palace and fled the country aboard a British warship, the very foreigners who had helped destroy his empire, because he was safer with them than with his own people. He sailed away into exile and died a few years later in Italy. That was the end of the sultans. But the family held onto one last title, the caliphate, the spiritual leadership, for 2 more years, with a cousin named Abdulmejid holding the sacred office. And then, in March of 1924, the new republic erased that too. In a single sweeping law, they abolished the caliphate and ordered every single member of the imperial family, more than 150 people, stripped of their citizenship and banished from the country forever. They had, in some cases, as little as 24 hours to leave. Think about who these people were. Princes and princesses who had lived their entire lives inside marble palaces on the shores of the Bosphorus, waited on hand and foot by armies of servants. To understand how far they fell, consider one princess named Neslisha. When she was born, just 3 years before the exile, cannons were fired across the empire to celebrate her arrival. Commemorative coins were struck in her honor, and her birth was entered in the official palace register as an event of state. She was, quite literally, born to the sound of celebratory cannon fire. 3 years later, she was a stateless refugee carried out of the only country she'd ever known in her family's arms, a toddler in exile before she was old enough to remember the palace she'd been born in. Many of the women of the family had never cooked a meal in their lives. Many had never handled money, never touched a coin, never paid for anything. And now they were being marched to train stations with whatever they could carry, handed passports valid for exactly 1 year, and shoved out into a world they had no idea how to survive in. The last caliph, Abdul-Maqsid, a gentle, artistic man who painted and played the cello, was hustled out so fast and so secretly that they didn't dare send him from the main station in Istanbul for fear of crowds and protests. They put him on a train at a small station outside the city and sent him off on the Orient Express into permanent exile. From a rented room in France, this fallen spiritual leader of the world's Muslims later wrote to a friend and quoted Shakespeare, Hamlet, describing himself as suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. The successor to the prophet, reduced to quoting a heartbroken fictional prince alone in a foreign country. And the family fell into real poverty. They scattered across Europe and the Middle East. They'd been ordered to sell 6 centuries of palaces and treasures within a year or have it all seized. So they sold in a panic for almost nothing, and some handed their valuables to trusted friends who simply kept everything and vanished. Princesses who had grown up in palaces died, broke in small apartments in Paris and Cairo, some of them never learning how to manage in the ordinary world. The women weren't even allowed to visit their homeland again until 1951. The men, not until 1973, nearly 50 years of exile for the crime of being born with the wrong last name. 600 years of empire, gone with a signature and a one-way train ticket. The next monarch on our list didn't just lose his empire. He was forced to personally sign the document that handed his entire country over to its enemy. Number 6. For more than 500 years, the Kingdom of Korea was ruled by a single dynasty, the Joseon Dynasty, one of the longest-lasting royal houses in the history of the world. And its story ends with an old emperor being forced, step by step, humiliation by humiliation, to sign away everything his ancestors had built, and then dying under such suspicious circumstances that his death set an entire nation on fire. His name was Gojong, and he had the misfortune of ruling Korea at the exact moment that the Empire of Japan decided to swallow it. Gojong became king as a child in the 1860s, and he inherited a kingdom that was being circled by predators. Korea in those days was sometimes called the Hermit Kingdom because it had tried for so long to seal itself off from the outside world. But the world would not leave it alone. Japan, China, and Russia all wanted control of the Korean peninsula, and Gojong spent his entire reign desperately trying to play them against each other to keep his country independent. He tried everything. He watched the growing threat from Japan and attempted to modernize. In a bold move, in 1897, he even elevated Korea from a kingdom to an empire, declaring himself emperor, an attempt to assert that Korea was the equal of the great powers around it, that it was nobody's junior partner, but it was a title with no army strong enough to defend it. And then the vice closed. Japan defeated China. Then Japan defeated Russia. And with its rivals cleared away, Japan turned its full attention to Korea. In 1905, Japanese officials forced the Korean government to sign a treaty making Korea a protectorate, which meant Japan now controlled its foreign affairs and its destiny. Gojong was horrified. he secretly sent envoys to a great international peace conference at The Hague in Europe, begging the world powers to recognize that this treaty had been signed under duress, that his country was being stolen. The world ignored him. The powers didn't care. And Japan's response to his defiance was swift and cruel. As punishment for that secret appeal, they forced Gojong to abdicate, to give up his throne, in 1907, handing the crown to his sickly, weak son. And then, in 1910, Japan finished the job. They formally annexed Korea outright. 500 years of the Joseon Dynasty and over 2,000 years of Korean independence simply erased. Korea vanished from the map and became a colony. Gojong lived on for nearly another decade as a powerless figurehead, a defeated old emperor kept as a symbol by the empire that had devoured his country, watching his kingdom disappear around him. And then, in January of 1919, he died suddenly. And this is where his story becomes something more than just another sad fall. Because almost immediately, rumors swept through Korea that the old emperor had been poisoned, murdered by the Japanese. Whether it was true or not has never been proven. But the Korean people believed it. Their grief and their fury at the death of their last true emperor, the symbol of the country they had lost, boiled over. His death became the spark. Just days later, timed around his funeral, millions of Koreans poured into the streets in a massive, nationwide uprising against Japanese rule. The March 1st movement, one of the largest protests in Korea's entire history. It was crushed, brutally, but it lit a fire of resistance that never fully went out. So Gojong watched his 500-year kingdom vanish, was forced to sign away his ancestors' empire piece by piece, and died a colonized figurehead. But in his death, he accidentally gave his people the rallying cry that would fuel their fight for freedom for decades. The next monarch on our list also lost his throne as a child, also became a puppet, but his story has an ending so strange, so bizarre, that they made it into a film that won 9 Academy Awards. Number 5. Picture the most powerful throne on Earth. For more than 2,000 years, China was ruled by emperors, sons of heaven, living gods, absolute rulers over a quarter of all humanity. And the very last person to sit on that throne, the final emperor in a line that stretched back before the time of Christ, ended his life pulling weeds in a public garden and buying a ticket, like any other tourist, to visit the palace where he was once worshipped as divine. His name was Puyi, and his life is one of the strangest journeys any human being has ever taken. Puyi became the emperor of China in 1908, when he was 2 years old. 2. He was pulled from his family and carried into the Forbidden City, the vast, walled palace complex at the heart of Beijing, by a procession of officials and eunuchs. Only his wet nurse was allowed to go with him. Imagine a toddler, screaming and confused, placed on the enormous dragon throne in front of thousands of kneeling officials, made the living god of the largest population on Earth. And the world he grew up in was almost impossibly bizarre. Inside the Forbidden City, the little emperor was treated as divine. His every whim was law. He was surrounded by a small army of servants and eunuchs. And here's a detail that tells you how strange this world was. The eunuchs who served him were required, by custom, to carry their own severed body parts, preserved in jars, hanging with them so that they could be buried whole. That was the surreal, gilded, deeply weird world that Puyi ruled as a child. Nobody could discipline him. He grew cruel. He would have his eunuchs flogged for fun, fire his air pistol at them, make them kneel and eat dirt. He was a small boy with the power of a god, and no one able to say no. But it was all already an illusion. Because outside the walls of the Forbidden City, China was in revolution. And in 1912, when Puyi was just 6 years old, the revolution won. He was forced to sign an abdication, or rather, it was signed for him, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. The dynasty was over before the emperor was old enough to read, and yet, in one of the many strange mercies and cruelties of his life, they let him stay. For years after he stopped being emperor, little Puyi was allowed to go on living inside the Forbidden City, still treated as an emperor within its walls, a god-king of an empire that no longer existed, playing at ruling a country that had moved on without him. It was a fantasy, a bubble, and eventually it burst and he was expelled from the palace for good. What followed was a descent through the 20th century's cruelest machinery. Desperate to reclaim some scrap of his birthright, Puyi made a fateful deal. He let the Empire of Japan install him as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo, a fake state the Japanese carved out of the northern China. He wore the costume of an emperor again, but he was nothing more than a figurehead, a prisoner in a golden cage, doing whatever his Japanese handlers told him. When Japan lost the Second World War, Puyi was captured by Soviet troops, then handed over to the Chinese communists, who put him in a prison for nearly a decade of re-education, forcing the former son of heaven to confess his crimes, to write out his life story, and remarkably, to learn to do ordinary things for himself. The man who had never in his life tied his own shoes or poured his own tea was taught, in a prison cell, how to be an ordinary human being. And then, in 1959, they released him. And here is where the story becomes almost unbearably poignant. The last emperor of China, the living God, the Son of Heaven, the absolute ruler of a quarter of the world, was set free to live as an ordinary citizen in Beijing. He was given a job. First as a street sweeper, and there are accounts of him getting lost in the very city he had once ruled, stopping strangers to ask for directions, telling them, almost as a curiosity, that he used to be the Emperor of China. Later, he was given a job he genuinely loved, as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Gardens, tending flowers with his own hands. And in his free time, the former god would sometimes go to the Forbidden City, the palace of his childhood, now a public museum, and he would buy an entrance ticket, like any other tourist, and walk through the halls where he had once sat on the dragon throne. He would point at things and tell people, "I used to play there. That was my throne. I used to live here." Nobody quite believed him, this quiet, ordinary, middle-aged man in simple clothes, claiming he had once been the Emperor of China. But he had. Puyi died in 1967 of cancer, an ordinary citizen with no title, no honors, no throne. And even his final days carried one last cruelty. He died just as Mao's Cultural Revolution was erupting across China, a violent purge in which mobs hunted down anyone connected to the old world, the elites, the past. The last emperor of China, the ultimate symbol of that old world, began receiving threats. Though the government quietly tried to protect him, he grew terrified and checked himself into a hospital. One person who knew him put it starkly. He was, they said, literally frightened to death. The last of a line that had ruled for millennia ended his days planting flowers, paying admission to see his own former home, and dying afraid, a gardener haunted by the ghost of the god he had once been. From living god to gardener in a single lifetime. The next ruler on our list was also imprisoned, but not in a foreign land. She was locked away inside her own palace in a kingdom that Americans know very well because it's part of the United States today. Number 4. Not long ago, within the lifetime of your great-grandparents, there was an independent kingdom in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with its own royal family, its own palace, its own crown. It was the Kingdom of Hawaii, and its last monarch was a queen who was overthrown, put on trial in her own throne room, and locked as a prisoner inside the very palace where she had once ruled, all so that a small group of businessmen could get rich. Her name was Liliʻuokalani, and she became Queen of Hawaii in 1891. She was a remarkable woman, intelligent, deeply cultured, and genuinely gifted. She was a composer who wrote more than 100 songs. If you've ever heard the haunting Hawaiian farewell song, Aloha Oe, that was written by the last Queen of Hawaii, She loved her islands and her people with everything she had. And that love is precisely what got her overthrown. Because by the late 1800s, a class of wealthy American and European businessmen, many of them the sons of missionaries, had grown enormously rich off Hawaii's sugar plantations, and they had been steadily stripping power away from the Hawaiian monarchy. When Liliʻuokalani became queen, she wanted to write a new constitution that would restore power to the crown and, most importantly, give the vote back to native Hawaiians in their own homeland. That was her unforgivable crime in the eyes of the sugar barons. She wanted Hawaiians to have power in Hawaii. So in January of 1893, a small group of these businessmen, backed shamefully by United States Marines who came ashore from a warship in the harbor, staged a coup. They surrounded the palace, declared the monarchy abolished, and demanded the queen step down. Liliʻuokalani, knowing her few guards could never fight off American Marines without her people being slaughtered, surrendered to avoid bloodshed. But she surrendered under protest, yielding not to the businessmen but, as she said, to the United States itself, trusting that when America learned what its agents had done in its name, it would undo this injustice. It did not. 2 years later, after some of her loyal supporters attempted an armed uprising to restore her, the new government came after the queen directly. And what they did to her was designed to break her spirit completely. They put the Queen of Hawaii on trial for treason in her own former throne room, the very room where she had once received ambassadors and held court as a sovereign, now converted into a courtroom to convict her. And then they imprisoned her for 8 months in an upstairs bedroom of her own palace. They frosted the glass on the windows so she couldn't see out. She was allowed no visitors except a single lady-in-waiting, no newspapers, no news of the outside world at all. And here is what she did with those 8 months of imprisonment. 2 things that will stay with you. First, she kept composing music. Locked in that room, she wrote songs about freedom, about her people, about her hopes for Hawaii. And her loyal supporters found a way to smuggle those songs out to the world. They hid them in the wrapping paper around bouquets of flowers brought to the imprisoned queen. Her music escaped her prison concealed in flower wrappings and reached her people on the outside. And second, she made a quilt. Together with her one companion, she sewed an enormous quilt, and she used it to record her own overthrow, stitch by stitch. She embroidered the dates right into the fabric. The day her kingdom was stolen, the day she was forced to abdicate, the day of her imprisonment. Forbidden from speaking, forbidden from newspapers, forbidden from telling anyone what had been done to her, she documented the death of her kingdom in thread, so that it could never be erased. That quilt still exists today. It hangs in the very room where she was imprisoned. You can go and see her overthrow, recorded in embroidery by the queen who lived it. Eventually, she was released and forced to formally abdicate to save her imprisoned supporters from execution. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii for good. Liliʻuokalani lived out her remaining years as a private citizen in the islands she had once ruled, watching the country she loved absorbed into someone else's. She died in 1917. The Hawaiian monarchy died with her. And there's a remarkable epilogue. A full century later, in 1993, the government of the United States did something almost unheard of. Congress passed, and the president signed, an official apology to the native people of Hawaii for the overthrow of their kingdom, admitting in writing that its own agents had helped illegally destroy a peaceful sovereign nation. The queen who surrendered under protest, trusting that America would one day recognize the wrong that was done to her. She was right. It just took 100 years, and she didn't live to see it. Liliʻuokalani lost her kingdom to greed and betrayal, but she died peacefully, honored by her people. The next king on our list was not so lucky. He was worshipped as a living god, and he was gunned down at his own dinner table by the person he least expected. Number 3. This one is the most recent on our list, and in some ways the most shocking, because it didn't happen in some distant century. It happened in 2001. There are people watching this right now who remember seeing it on the news. A king who was literally worshipped as a god was massacred, along with almost his entire family, in his own palace by his own son. The kingdom was Nepal, high in the Himalayas, and its king, Birendra, was not just a king to his people. In the Hindu tradition of Nepal, the king was regarded as a living incarnation of the god Vishnu, a god on earth, walking among his people. You didn't just respect this man, you worshipped him. King Birendra was, by most accounts, a gentle and beloved ruler who had voluntarily given up much of his absolute power to allow Nepal to become a democracy. His people loved him. His heir was his eldest son, Crown Prince Dipendra, educated at Eton, the elite English school, and trained at the British Military Academy at Sandhurst. Charming, popular, the golden boy, the future of the dynasty. But Dipendra was in love with a woman his mother, Queen Aishwarya, refused to accept, a woman from a rival aristocratic family. And the conflict over that forbidden love had reached a breaking point. The queen had allegedly threatened to strip Dipendra of his succession if he married the woman he loved. He was trapped between the throne and his heart. On the 1st of June, 2001, the royal family gathered for their regular Friday dinner party at the palace in Kathmandu. Dipendra had been drinking heavily, and at some point that evening, he left the room and came back dressed in camouflage combat fatigues, carrying an arsenal of weapons, an assault rifle, a submachine gun, a shotgun, a pistol, and he opened fire on his own family. He shot his father, the king, the living god, first. Then he turned the guns on the rest of them. His mother, the queen, his younger brother, his sister, aunts, uncles, cousins. In a few minutes of gunfire in that dining room, the Crown Prince of Nepal murdered 9 members of his own family, including the king and queen, and wounded several more. It was the worst royal massacre since the Russian revolutionaries shot the Romanovs in a basement in 1918, and this time it was done by the heir to the throne himself. Then Dipendra walked out into the palace garden and shot himself in the head. But here is the almost unbelievable twist. He didn't die immediately. The bullet put him into a deep coma, and under Nepal's law of succession, with the king dead, the crown passed automatically to the next in line, which was Dipendra. So the man who had just slaughtered his own family was declared the new king of Nepal while he lay brain dead in a hospital bed, kept alive by machines. For 3 days, Nepal had a king who was a mass murderer in a coma, who would never wake, who would never even know he was king. The newspapers called him the Ghost King. Then he died, having reigned for 3 days without ever opening his eyes. The crown passed to Birendra's brother, Gyanendra, who, suspiciously, had not been present at the dinner that night. And the strange details only pile up the closer you look. The official inquiry ruled Dipendra's death a suicide, yet Dipendra was right-handed, and the fatal bullet had entered his left temple. During the massacre, he reportedly had his uncle Gyanendra's son directly in front of him and did not shoot, and it was that exact branch of the family that walked away with the throne. Many Nepalese to this day flatly refuse to believe the official story, convinced their beloved prince was framed, that the whole thing was a conspiracy to seize the crown. The truth may never be fully known. The 2 men who could have explained it, the king and the prince, were both dead within days. And Gyanendra proved a disaster as king. The people who had worshipped the monarchy for centuries turned against it with stunning speed. And in 2008, just 7 years after that dinner party, Nepal abolished the monarchy entirely. The living gods were voted out of existence and told to leave the palace like ordinary citizens. King Birendra died at his own dinner table, watching his family cut down in front of him, never knowing that the massacre would take the whole dynasty down with him within a decade. The next man on our list saw his fall coming for months and spent his final days as the most unwanted man on earth, a dying king that no country would take. Number 2. Now, we come back to the man we started with. The one dying in a foreign hospital bed with a bag of his homeland's soil hidden under his pillow. It's time to tell you who he was and how he got there. Because his fall from the absolute summit of power to stateless, dying exile is one of the most dramatic in all of modern history. His name was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and he was the last Shah of Iran. He didn't just call himself a king. He took the ancient Persian title Shahanshah, the King of Kings, and he ruled Iran for 37 years, sitting atop one of the richest, most strategically important thrones on the planet, floating on a sea of oil, armed and backed by the most powerful nations in the world. At his peak, the Shah was untouchable. In 1971, he threw what has been called one of the most extravagant parties in the history of the world, a celebration of 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy, staged in a purpose-built tent city in the desert beside the ancient ruins of Persepolis. He flew in kings, queens, and presidents from around the globe. The food was catered by one of the finest restaurants in Paris. The wine flowed by the thousands of bottles. The guests slept in luxurious, silk-lined tents and dined off special china. It reportedly costed the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, a staggering display of wealth in a country where many ordinary people were still desperately poor. That party was the Shah at his zenith, so certain of his glory that he spent a fortune telling the world his dynasty was the heir to 25 centuries of empire and would last forever. He was modernizing his country at breakneck speed, and he seemed as permanent as the oil beneath his kingdom. He believed his dynasty would rule for generations. But underneath, the pressure was building. His rule was autocratic. His secret police were feared and hated. The vast oil wealth wasn't reaching ordinary people fast enough, and the breakneck modernization was tearing at the fabric of a deeply traditional, religious society. Opposition was growing, from the political left, from the religious establishment, from ordinary Iranians who felt crushed and unheard. And it all began to crystallize around a single exiled religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Through 1978, the protests grew and grew, swelling into millions of people in the streets. And the Shah, the King of Kings, with one of the largest militaries in the region at his command, faced the choice every falling monarch faces. He could order a massive, bloody crackdown to hold his throne, or he could go. And in January of 1979, rather than drown his country in blood, the Shah left Iran. He flew out officially for a vacation, and he never came back. Weeks later, the Ayatollah returned in triumph. The monarchy was abolished, and Iran became an Islamic republic. 2,500 years of Persian monarchy ended. And here is where the Shah's story becomes a special kind of tragedy, because he didn't just lose his throne. He lost the entire world's willingness to have him. The most powerful man in the Middle East, who had been courted and flattered by presidents and kings, suddenly discovered that now that he was fallen, nobody wanted him. He was a political radioactive object. Everywhere he tried to land, his presence threatened to cause an international crisis. He wandered the globe like a ghost. Egypt, Morocco, the Bahamas, Mexico, from country to country, an exiled king with nowhere to rest. And it was made infinitely worse by the fact that he was dying. The Shah was secretly suffering from cancer, lymphoma, that had been quietly eating away at him for years. He desperately needed advanced medical treatment, and that need forced the fateful decision to let him into the United States for care. And when America admitted the Shah, the fury in Iran exploded. Revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and seized dozens of American hostages, holding them for 444 days, demanding the Shah be returned to Iran to face trial and execution. His very presence had triggered one of the worst international crises in decades, and suddenly, even America, his oldest ally, needed him gone. So the dying King of Kings was pushed back out into the world, sicker and more unwanted than ever, his body failing, shuttled between countries that treated him like a curse. Finally, one man took him in, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who out of loyalty to his old friend offered the Shah a place to die with some dignity. And die he did. On the 27th of July, 1980, in a military hospital in Cairo, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the King of Kings, ruler of Iran for 37 years, died in exile of cancer and its complications, far from the throne he had been so certain would last forever. And when his wife went to prepare his body, she reached under his pillow and drew out a small bag. Inside it was soil, Iranian soil. The King of Kings had died, clutching a handful of the only piece of his kingdom he had left, a bag of dirt from the country that no longer wanted him and that he would never see again. He got a state funeral in Egypt, attended by a handful of loyal friends and a few other exiled royals. Fitting company, one deposed king mourned by others. And he was buried in a mosque in Cairo, where he lies to this day. The last Shah of Iran, in the wrong country, forever. Which brings us, finally, to number 1. Every ruler on this list lived on after their kingdom fell. That was the whole tragedy, the surviving in the wreckage. But the last man chose the opposite. He decided that if his kingdom was going to die, he would die with it in the same instant. And he did something in his final moments so extraordinary that it turned him into a legend that has lasted for 500 years. For over 1,000 years, there was an empire that considered itself the direct, unbroken continuation of ancient Rome. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but they never called themselves that. They called themselves Romans, the true heirs of the Caesars, and their capital, Constantinople, was for centuries the greatest, richest, most magnificent city in the Western world. The Roman Empire, in one form or another, had existed for over 1,500 years, and it all came down to one man, on one morning, on a crumbling city wall. His name was Constantine XI, and he was the last emperor of Rome. By the time he took the throne in 1449, the 1,000-year empire had withered to almost nothing, essentially just the single great city of Constantinople, surrounded on all sides by the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. The empire of the Caesars had shrunk to one walled city, waiting for the end. And the end came in the spring of 1453, when the young Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, just 21 years old and burning with ambition, arrived at the city walls with an army of tens of thousands and the largest cannon the world had ever seen. That cannon is worth pausing on, because it tells you how empires really die. It was built by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, and Orban had first offered his monstrous weapon to the Byzantines, to Constantine himself, to defend the city. But the empire was so poor by then that Constantine couldn't afford to pay him. So Orban walked across the lines and sold the same cannon to the Sultan, who paid whatever he asked. The weapon that would shatter the walls of Constantinople had been offered to its defenders first, and they were too broke to buy it. The gun was 27 feet long and could hurl a stone ball the weight of a grand piano over a mile through the air. It had to be dragged to the city by 60 oxen. Constantine had perhaps 7,000 men to defend miles of ancient wall against an army many times that size. It was hopeless, and everyone knew it. The Sultan offered him a deal. Surrender the city, and you can leave alive. Keep your life, keep your family, rule some territory somewhere. Just hand over Constantinople. Constantine refused. He would not be the emperor who handed away Rome. He chose to stay and die with his city. For weeks, the great cannon battered the walls by day, while the exhausted defenders rebuilt them by night, a desperate race between cannon and shovel. But the end was inevitable. On the 29th of May, 1453, Mehmed launched his final, overwhelming assault, and the walls were breached, and the Ottoman army began to pour into the city. And this is the moment that made Constantine immortal. As the enemy flooded in and all was lost, the last emperor of Rome did something extraordinary. He tore off his imperial regalia, the purple robes, the ornaments, everything that marked him as emperor, and he threw it all to the ground. He didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want to be captured and paraded or have his body held up as a trophy. He wanted to die as an anonymous soldier, just one more man defending his city. And then he drew his sword and charged into the oncoming army, and he was never seen again. His body was never found. The Sultan's men searched through the piles of the dead, desperate to find the emperor, and they could not identify him. He had vanished completely into the chaos of the fall, exactly as he intended. 1,500 years of Roman emperors, and the very last one simply disappeared into the smoke of his burning city, leaving no crown, no corpse, no trophy, nothing for the conqueror to hold up. And out of that vanishing came one of the most beautiful legends in all of history. The Greeks could not accept that their emperor was simply gone. So they told a story, the legend of the Marble Emperor. They said that at the final moment, as the city fell, an angel swept down from heaven, rescued Constantine, turned him into marble, and hid him in a secret cave beneath the city. And there he sleeps, frozen in stone, waiting. And one day, he will wake and rise and take back the city and restore the empire that vanished. For 500 years, people have passed that legend down. Some believe it even now. Constantine XI got the ending that not one other monarch on this list was granted. He did not have to live on in the wreckage. He did not die a gardener or a stateless exile or a prisoner or a lonely old man in a foreign hotel dreaming of home. He died in the same instant as his empire, sword in hand, and in doing so, he stepped out of history and into myth. The empire vanished, and the emperor vanished with it, so completely that his people decided he must simply be sleeping, waiting to come home. So there they are. A dozen crowns from every corner of the world, spanning more than 500 years of history. A May king exiled for a lifetime, over 34 days on the throne. A playboy emperor who handed away an ancient dynasty with a single sentence and spent 50 years in the casinos of Europe. A king who predicted his own fall as a card game joke and then ate himself to death in exile. A gentle emperor who loved his country too much to fight for himself. A king carried off on a bullock cart, his ruby lost forever. A 600-year dynasty put on a train and scattered into poverty. An emperor forced to sign away his own nation. A living god who ended his days as a gardener, paying to visit his own palace. A queen who stitched her stolen kingdom into a quilt. A worshipped king gunned down at his own table. A king of kings dying stateless with a bag of soil under his pillow. And the last Caesar vanishing into the smoke rather than outlive his empire. Every one of them was born into the absolute certainty that their line would last forever, that they were chosen by God, or were gods themselves, that the crown would pass from their hands to their children's and on, world without end. It's the one belief every monarchy is built on: permanence. The idea that this, unlike everything else in the world, will not end. And every single one of them was proven wrong in their own lifetime, with their own eyes. They didn't read about the fall of their kingdom in a history book. They lived it. They stood there and watched it disappear. The palaces, the power, the worship, the whole world they were born to rule. And then most of them had to keep on living anyway, in the silence that came after. Because that, in the end, is the real lesson buried in all of these stories. It isn't that the mighty fall. Everybody knows the mighty fall. It's that the fall is so often not the end. That the truly cruel fate is to survive it. To have been a god and become a gardener. To have ruled an empire and die in a rented room. To have worn the oldest crown on earth and spend your last years just wanting, more than anything, to be allowed to go home. They had everything. And in the end, almost none of them could keep the one thing that mattered most. Not the gold, not the palaces, not the power. Just a place to call their own, and someone left to remember they were ever there. That's what a kingdom disappearing really looks like. Not a crown falling in a battle. An old man, far from home, holding a bag of soil, remembering when the whole world knew his name.